They are dead. They will not live. They are shades. They will not arise. To that end you have visited them with destruction, and wiped out all remembrance of them. During the cataclysmic events of the Horus Heresy, reality itself began to pull apart. The fabric of the material universe was torn by the actions of Horus and the traitor legions. The galaxy as established by the new Imperium had promised to be a beacon of the Emperor's vision of unity and a new golden age for humanity. Instead, it descended into chaos as the traitors unleashed their malefic energies upon Terra and the Imperial Palace. Throughout the conflict and wider galaxy, warp storms, previously rare and localized, erupted, sometimes in very specific locations, at other times randomly. They distort space-time in ways unimaginable to mortal humans and make space travel near to impossible. Many worlds were engulfed in madness, their inhabitants driven to insanity by the whispers of demons and the howling winds of the Immaterium. In this maelstrom of cosmic upheaval, the ASTARTES Librarians, once viewed with suspicion, wariness, even censure, found their roles radically transformed. No longer merely warriors who dabbled in questionable arcane practices, they became indispensable bastions of stability and sometimes sanity amidst the crumbling reality of the Materium that was falling all around the Loyalists. As the heresy raged, the perception of Librarian ASTARTES evolved significantly. Once seen as potential liabilities due to their psychic ability and the inherent risks of warp manipulation, they now stood as vital defenders against the encroaching darkness. The Librarians' mastery of psychic powers allowed them to shield their battle brothers from the warping effects of chaos, creating shields of sanity amidst the fire and madness that lashed around battle brothers defending critical Imperial installations. Their ability also to navigate the turbulent tides of the warp when it was necessary became crucial for maintaining communication and coordination across the embattled Imperium, and played a pivotal role in countering the sorcerous and demonic assaults of the traitor legions, engaging in duels of psychic might that could determine the fate of entire worlds. With the speed to which the heresy unfolded and the never-before-seen horrors that emerged alongside the traitors, this rapidly revealed the true value of the Librarians, who had until this point never really had much of a purpose beyond some latent curiosity. Now though, they were no longer seen merely as warriors with dangerous gifts, dabblers in things that were best left alone. Instead, they were seen as an essential tool for any legion that wanted to survive, even as guardians of the Emperor's light, standing firm against the disintegration of reality itself and the ever-pervasive darkness. Long before this time, in the glorious days before the tragedy of the heresy, the galaxy was still burning with the zeal of the Great Crusade. The Legiones Astartes stood as the Emperor's finest creation, a testament to his majesty, a testament to his mastery of humanity itself and the vision of a united galactic Imperium. These warriors of his were each a fortress of flesh and armour, masters of war, forged to bring his irresistible truth to the stars. Yet in their ranks a new kind of warrior began to emerge, one whose powers were not solely derived from genetic enhancements or martial prowess, but from the very warp itself. In this time, PSYKERS were much rarer than in M41 in the contemporary period, and the concept itself was almost unknown. But in time it became necessary to more formally discipline some Astartes who fell into this role, and as others began to consider their use, so more followed. Thus were born the Librarians of the Astartes, scholars of the esoteric and wielders of arcane forces. The origins of the Astartes Librarians lies in those tumultuous years which led up to the heresy. For the Emperor, in his wisdom, I'm putting wisdom in air quotes, had long been wary of the PSYKERS' touch upon reality, knowing well the seductive lure and the hidden perils of the warp. But also, don't mention that to anybody because surely nothing could go wrong. Yet the question of those who found themselves psychically adept was a difficult one. On the one hand, they held the potential that could tip the scales in battles where even the ASTARTES may falter. On the other side of the coin, well, best not to think about that. So it was that during the Great Crusade, the first whispers of change began, because in those days each legion was a reflection of its Primarch, and some of these godlike beings were more inclined towards the mysteries of the mind than others. Which in some respects makes you wonder why the Emperor in his great wisdom didn't more carefully plan for the emergence of psychically powerful Astartes, because it was basically a guaranteed thing. Forget about telling them anything to do with the warp and chaos. Among these, of course, the infamous Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. Truly a giant in every respect, physically, mentally, and a towering figure of psychic prowess. His legion were a known crucible of psychic talent, and Magnus believed that the warp, when properly understood, could be harnessed without fear, and so he sought to cultivate this understanding within his warriors. They saw this not as dangerous for them, it was a logical endpoint of their sense of self, it was their whole identity really. And so it was that Magnus, Sanguinius and Jakati Khan successfully advocated for the Librarian program, allowing psychically gifted warriors of the Thousand Suns to train others and thereby establish Librarius departments within other legions. The Emperor, recognizing both the promise and potential peril of these developments, convened the Council of Nicaea. Here, amid the grand halls of the Emperor's presence, the fate of the Librarians was to be decided, and voices from across the Imperium rose in debate. Some, like Magnus, argued passionately for the sanctioned use of psychic power, seeing them as an evolution of humanity's potential, or in his own words, the Thousand Suns will be at the forefront of a new universal order. He saw this as an inevitability. But not everybody saw it this way. Others, including the Space Wolves, Imperial Fists and the Death Guard, objected, each with their own specific reasons. Mortarion of the Death Guard, for example, despised PSYKERS due to his upbringing on Barbarous, a world that was ruled by necromantic overlords. And so this Council of Nicaea became the crucible of the debate, where factions opposed to PSYKERS argued for the program's dismantling. Ultimately, the Emperor decreed a ban on psychic powers within the legions, and Librarians were absorbed back into the ranks as standard battle brothers. But how easy would it be to do that? Apparently not very, because after the decree of Nicaea, Lorgar offered his chaplains services to other legions to best aid the Librarians to reintegrate, and those chaplains travelled among the legions to counsel former Librarians who were very uncomfortable at the loss of their psychic role, and so they would attempt to ease them back into duty. And while many Primarchs accepted Lorgar's offer, the use of chaplains spread to legions such as the Dark Angels, Emperor's Children, World Eaters and the Death Guard, which you might notice all have something in common. Other Primarchs such as Sanguinius declined, the duties being given over to their own existing wardens. The Emperor's decree, meanwhile, would in the fullness of time prove to be a severe handicap to the Loyalist legions who fought for him during the Horus Heresy. So much so that later during the outbreak of the full heresy, the limitations of this decision became very apparent. One of the first and most notable being at the infamous Battle of Calth. The Ultramarines faced one of the most horrific battles of the heresy, and here warp entities were summoned en masse by the Wordbearers. The Ultramarines soon found that their physical weapons were proving considerably less effective, although melee weapons far more so than ranged. Primarch Guilliman realised that only psychic discipline could most effectively combat the demonic invaders. And so in No Fear, Guilliman reflects upon how Nicaea had deprived the Ultramarines of their best weapon against these horrors from the warp in the Librarius, stating that, quote, "It seems to me, with the Council of Nicaea, that we voluntarily rid ourselves of the one weapon we might have had against the warp. We could dearly use the Librarius now." His warriors nod in silent agreement. "We should petition for their reinstatement," he adds, "if we ever get the chance. We cannot do it now, there is no time, no means. But if any of us survive this, know that the edict must be overturned. It is as though our enemy knew what was coming and orchestrated events so that we would voluntarily cast aside our only practical weapon, the moment before it was needed. This is always a great quote for me, as the idea that Guilliman would openly state that a decree of the Emperor be abolished is pretty astonishing, although on the other hand Guilliman is all about logical reasoning, and so if an action, no matter who it's from, is proven to be ineffective or even dangerous in this example, then he would say so regardless. It's something he would reiterate in Dark Imperium as well when he returned in M41, clearly noting that the need for the Librarians were just as important as ever. Regardless of the Emperor's orders, Librarians were unofficially still used by some legions, and overall the use of Astartes with psychic powers played a crucial role in the Siege of Terra and Horus's defeat. The Loyalist legions saw their Librarians as guardians against the warp's malign influence, using their power to shield their brethren and unravel the schemes of traitors. Whereas the traitor legions and the promise of psychic power presented a double-edged sword. They were free from the Emperor's constraints and so could indulge in forbidden arts, the Librarians becoming sorcerers of immense power, but also conduits for the warp's insidious corruption. And the most tragic of these was Magnus and his 1,000 sons, who, despite their debatably noble intentions, fell to the ruinous powers, their psychic gifts twisted into utter damnation. In the years that followed the heresy, as the Imperium sought to rebuild and heal, the legacy of the Astartes Librarians was cemented. They were seen not merely as warriors, but as custodians of the mind and spirit and the soul itself, responsible for the delicate balance between power and peril. As the millennia passed, the role of Librarians and chaplains as wardens of an Astartes chapter became ever more embedded, so that now they form the guardian core of a Space Marine chapter. The evolution of the Astartes Librarians is one that arose out of a need for defensive and offensive balance against enemies who wielded powers far beyond the material realm. This necessary adaptation walked the fine line between the salvation and destruction of many a legion, chapter, and indeed individual Astartes. It remains a prime example of how those who serve the Imperium are so often caught between the endless struggle against darkness within and without, how they must retain their guard, retain an ever-present vigilance paired with wisdom and a personal restraint in the face of unimaginable, almost unlimited power. For where their battle brothers take to the field, they are warriors of the mind, who through fire and blood have managed to survive through immense discipline, to now take their place in the Emperor's grand design for all humanity. A librarian's duty demands unyielding vigilance and the fortification of mind and spirit against all temptation. Their role is to continuously test the resolve of their brethren, vigilant for any signs of wavering strength or deeper problems. Their responsibilities are broad-ranging, encompassing roles as psychic warriors, scholars, guardians, and teachers. Their unique position within the Astartes requires them to maintain a diligent stewardship over their formidable powers whilst continuing unwavering requirements of duty and discipline. And librarians must guard always against the corrupting influence of the warp, which means maintaining an unyielding mental fortitude to resist any possibility of corruption. And this is something that you come back to again and again as fundamental to the librarian discipline. Because they are tasked with the mental and the spiritual health of their chapter, they will utilize their psychic abilities to probe for signs of warp corruption or taint among their brothers constantly, and such vigilance extends to themselves and to one another. They must continually monitor their own minds for any hints of instability or impurity, for their role is too vital to suffer any failure. Blessed with power beyond the grasp of mortals, they bear the responsibility of being ruthlessly uncompromising when it comes to detecting the taint of chaos everywhere, which means that at all times there can never be room for complacency. Even for those of legend, such as the Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines, he is a figure known for his unmatched psychic prowess, equipped with a level of foresight that often skirts the edges of sanity. But he has peered into the abyss more times than most, and can even stretch his mind all across the galaxy. His mind is a complex fortress and has withstood the seductive whispers, enabling him to guide his brothers through countless battles. Yet even as powerful a figure as Tigurius remains acutely aware that even a single misstep could edge him into darkness, because for librarians their struggle is relentless and their vigilance eternal. And that's one reason as to why librarians are so few within the chapters of the ASTARTES, for while their powers are very great, they must walk a line far more complex than their outward appearance as masters of the warp and battlefield would suggest, or that any would give pause to consider. And like so many specific disciplines of the ASTARTES, that means that very few aspirants end up becoming librarians, because they must be able to retain the strength of mind that allows them to walk the razor's edge, where even a momentary lapse in judgment could invite damnation. Their lives will be dedicated to study, discipline, and consideration of all that they are. Many will remain in the librarium unless they are required elsewhere at all times, because in these halls they are able to meditate, contemplate, and practice maintaining the mental shield that they must use at all times. But librarians also serve as mentors and teachers within the chapters. They will train new aspirants in the ways of the ASTARTES and in the use of basic psychic abilities where appropriate. This responsibility can involve imparting not only martial skill, but also the philosophical foundations necessary to wield such power responsibly. They teach their students the importance of course in loyalty, honour and vigilance, and ensure that the next generation of librarians can uphold the ideals of the chapter and that of the Imperium. But as noted, one of their most critical responsibilities is in assessing potential aspirants for a chapter, because whilst this is obviously important for all Loyalist ASTARTES at a basic level, for any chapters who have, for whatever reason, had some suspicion in the past directed toward them, or just for those who have very troubled histories, the need for absolute approval from chapter librarians on aspirants becomes extremely critical. For example, within the revered halls of the Dark Angels, the role of the librarians in screening young aspirants for psychic potential is one of the most serious and guarded duties, because psychic individuals are already rare among humanity, but even rarer still are those who possess the potential to harness those gifts without succumbing to the warp's seduction. Then, within the shrouded history of those such as the Dark Angels, who even now are burdened with the secret legacy of the Fallen, their librarians must be utterly ruthless in their evaluation, for allowing any weak-willed psyker to advance through the aspirant process could risk absolute disaster, risking not only the lives of their brothers but indeed the integrity of their gene seed and the chapter itself. So evaluation at this stage is all important because an individual may not even be aware themselves of their abilities, and any potential problems may not even arise until decades or even centuries later. So a lapse in judgment by a chapter librarian now could result in a catastrophic loss of control further down the line, where a once trusted, seemingly innocuous battle brother unknowingly becomes corrupted over time at an imperceptibly incremental level until they one day unleash a torrent of psychic energy capable of annihilating an entire company or compromising a mission of paramount importance. Such are the actions of the likes of Tzeentch. Yet beyond the immediate physical dangers, there lies a far graver risk, the potential corruption of the chapter gene seed. Now, as we know, ASTARTES are created using gene seed harvested from their fallen predecessors, and some may hold also a vault of pristine gene seed as a security hedge against any corruption of a chapter, but many though do not have this luxury. So were a psyker with insufficient mental fortitude to be inducted into a chapter, later then to become unknowingly corrupted, the consequences could really be significant. Because chaos corruption does not always just occur in the mind. The warp is a very powerful energy that can make itself very physically present in the material realm. So any corruption would potentially not only doom future recruits, but could tarnish the legacy of an entire chapter, especially one such as the Dark Angels, reduced to becoming just one of the many cautionary tales recorded within the archives of the Imperium. And this is a fact powerfully illustrated in the Blood Angels and the Black Rage. Not exactly the same comparison, but you will see what I'm talking about. Because the genetic flaw that is not simply physical within them, but it's one triggered by the eternal psychic resonance of the death of their Primarch, which emanates from the warp itself. but we will discuss more about that soon in another video. But the point is that the warp can influence the physical makeup of individuals in the material space. So a librarian's task is not merely one of competent selection, but it's about safeguarding the chapter's stability, ensuring that the continuity of their eternal vigil against the enemies of mankind stays unbroken. Because in many ways, they are perhaps the most critical figures in safeguarding an ASTARTES chapter at a very fundamental level. But the question then becomes, where do you recruit potential librarian stock from? Given the risks of potential corruption, drawing from a human populace underhive or backwater world as many chapters do, that seems to present very obvious risks. And of course we could imagine existing librarians putting potential new recruits through a very highly stringent vetting process, even more so than ordinary recruits. But many chapters turn to a more stable pool of prospects, the Scholastia Psychana. And this is one of two branches of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the other being the League of Black Ships. The Telepathica is a vast and vital institution dedicated to training young psykers in the mastery and control of their abilities, and again this rose out of the necessity presented from the aftermath of the heresy. Each psyker's future within the Imperium is determined by their innate abilities and character, and the initial evaluation process divides recruits based on their psychic power, character, and their just willingness to learn. And as is typical throughout all aspects of Imperial discipline, the Psychana prefers younger recruits as they're more easily trained, shaped, and indoctrinated. Consequently, this means that those who are recruited are often children, and they will then receive further training for significant roles within the Imperium, such as the renowned Inquisitor Gideon Ravenor. Of course, conversely, psykers deemed too weak, dangerous, or old are sacrificed to sustain the Emperor. Their fate will be to board the black ships bound for Terra, where eventually their souls will be consumed by the insatiable hunger of the Emperor. Within the Telepathica, there are two core ranks assessed for psychic training. The first are referred to as primary psykers. These individuals possess the power and the strength of character needed to resist possession and demonic corruption. After about 5 years of basic training, they're sent to serve in roles best suited to their abilities. The youngest might join the Space Marines as librarians, whilst others could become Primaris battle psykers in the Imperial Guard. The most gifted may even ascend to the ranks of Inquisitors or Grey Knights. Then there are the secondary psykers. These constitute the majority of other psykers, but they're still valuable, and they'll be trained as astropaths generally. This role is in fact crucial to the Imperium's survival because they're able to communicate across vast interstellar distances, sending and receiving telepathic messages. And because this is the only practical means of connecting the galaxy-spanning Imperium, some psykers from both primary and secondary ranks are also given over to the Adeptus Astronomica for further training. The Scholastia Psychana thus ensures that psykers are not only a powerful asset to the Imperium, but also a controlled, disciplined force, and very integral to the survival and function of humanity's galactic empire. Now, before we get into the specifics of librarians themselves, a common question that I've seen arise is what separates an ASTARTES librarian and a Chaos sorcerer? Both are Space Marines of a fashion, both use the warp. Outside of their ideological differences, what separates the two? I think it's really best described as being two sides of the same coin, with one belonging to discipline and duty and the other power and instant gratification. Or, to put it another way, one is a carefully planned routine with an end goal, and the other is the quick fix to achieve adjacent goals. I think that neatly frames the differences, as one has an emphasis on careful development with a linear objective that's achievable and reasonable, and the alternative is a means to an end, hoping to achieve it as quickly as possible, no matter if it might be a little dangerous, so long as we can move on to the more interesting, shiny and desirable activities as soon as possible. Librarians are rigorously trained to master their psychic abilities through study, meditation, and discipline. Their journey to mastery is a long and arduous one, often taking decades to complete. They will learn to control their powers with precision, minimizing the risks associated with using the warp, and all librarians operate under strict guidelines and an unwavering sense of duty. They're bound by the edicts of their chapter and the Imperium to safeguard against the corrupting influences of the warp, and that requires, as we said, immense mental fortitude and an unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. Through their training, librarians become adept at harnessing the psychic abilities such as telekinesis, precognition, and mental shielding, which they will use to protect their battle brothers and defeat the Imperium's enemies. Unlike their Chaos counterparts, librarians also strive to remain critically in control, minimize the warp's influence on their mind and soul and that of others, and that's really fundamental to the center of everything they do and indeed their very being. Now, in stark contrast, sorcerers embrace the chaotic nature of the warp and the dark entities that dwell within. It's typical of the followers of Chaos, undivided or otherwise, that their pursuit of power leads them to forge pacts with the dark gods and beings of the warp, exchanging their loyalty and often their very souls for vast, immediate power. Often this will mean that sorcerers wield magic with a destructive potential far greater than that of most librarians, but this power, of course, comes at a steep price. By taking shortcuts through soul pacts and dark rituals, sorcerers expose themselves to the all-consuming influence of the gods and the warp, which runs the risk of a sorcerer not just losing their mind, but enduring physical mutations, even in extreme examples, transformation into a chaos spawn. What follows is their emergence as entirely pitiable, mindless, gibbering creatures twisted by the powers of the warp. But all of this, though, is the trade-off a Chaos Psyker is willing to make. They want all the power they can wield as fast as possible, and because of this, while being more dangerous to their enemies, a sorcerer's abilities are often unpredictable and volatile to themselves and their allies, which in fairness reflects the unstable, uncaring, twisted nature of the gods themselves. But I think just to go a little further, we can consider two giants of the ASTARTES Psyker world: Ezekiel, the chief librarian of the Dark Angels, and Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, albeit for the sake of this video, a very abridged version. Ezekiel is well known to embody the ideal of an ASTARTES librarian. He wields formidable psychic abilities and unyielding dedication to the chapter, a master of battle, using his powers to safeguard his brothers, obliterate the enemies. But his strength to wield such power is the critical distinction, because in the ability of unleashing such devastating power from the warp, this lies in years of self-discipline. It's that fortitude which allows them to wield the warp at a level that would burn out the eyes and disintegrate the body of most lesser psykers. But for himself, he can unleash devastating psychic storms of power against the enemies of humanity without succumbing to its destructive physical consequences or corrupting influence, like many other chief librarians. And you might think, well, that all sounds very straightforward. Yes, because it is. Except when we come to Ahriman, on the other hand, the perspective comes more into focus. Because the path of the Chaos Sorcerer, and incidentally Ahriman's tale, a very tragic one, something that I hope to cover sooner or later, as I love Ahriman as a character, more so than Abaddon perhaps. Anyway, this specific example is not something of a hidden mystery again though. It's the classic tale of the Thousand Suns, but it does illustrate, I think, very clearly the differences between the Chaos Sorcerer's perspective versus that of the Librarians. So Ahriman was, of course, once this promising librarian of the Thousand Suns, but as was typical of that legion, their thirst for knowledge and power led him to delve deep into the mysteries of the warp, ultimately aligning himself, as did his legion, with the Chaos God Tzeentch. And in his quest to save his legion from the mutating corruption of the flesh change that had been plaguing the Astartes of the Thousand Suns, Ahriman cast the Rubric of Ahriman, this spell of immense power, but that would soon be revealed to have catastrophic consequences. And the powers unleashed reduced the Marines without psychic abilities to ash, sealing every clasp and joint of their armour, trapping their souls within. They were still capable of fighting and receiving orders from their masters, yet without an aspiring sorcerer to guide and remake them, Rubric Marines tend to fall into inactivity or, if destroyed, literal dust. In combat, however, their battle hunger will return and they tend to move around more like their former selves. But the point is that fundamentally the differences between librarians and sorcerers underscore this deeper narrative that exists between loyalist and traitor, humanity and chaos. It's about having power or holding back and having some restraint. Where we see librarians representing the disciplined, duty-bound psykers of the Imperium, using their abilities with caution and purpose, chaos sorcerers are consumed by instantaneous needs for ambition, wielding raw destructive power at the cost of their own and indeed others' humanity. And the contrast balances that struggle between the very soul of the Imperium that we see upon every world system and the wars at the front lines of Imperial territory, where the balance between discipline and corruption hangs precariously over all, like a pall of existential terror. As noted earlier, the ASTARTES Librarium is a place shrouded in an aura of serenity and mystery, and for some reverence. It is a place where knowledge and power intertwine in service to the Emperor. Situated deep within the fortress monastery of a Space Marine chapter, the Librarium is as much a sanctuary as it is a bastion of psychic might. Many chapters will also use it as a vault for their ancient secrets. Upon approaching the Librarium, one is greeted by towering doors of adamantium, etched with intricate runes and symbols that glow faintly with a blue luminescence. These runes are wards against demonic intrusion and protect the sacred space within. As those doors will open, a cool, musted air rushes out, carrying with it the scent of ancient parchment, oils, incense used in the rituals conducted by the librarians. And librariums are generally so carefully concealed and guarded that the administratum can only make educated guesses about how many even exist, let alone what materials the vast troves of information within contain. And this is one reason as to why many ASTARTES chapter histories remain shrouded and undocumented by the larger Imperium. The interior itself is dimly lit, with flickering candlelight casting shadows that dance across the walls. The architecture is grand yet austere, characterised by vaulted ceilings, Gothic arches, all which create a sense of scale befitting the legendary heroes who walk these halls. Undoubtedly, some of the past most famous librarians are revered and remembered in statue form. The walls are lined with shelves which stretch up into the darkness, filled with tomes bound in leather and metal, each book a repository of knowledge containing the histories of the Imperium, studies on Xenos species, and arcane lore concerning the warp. Central to the Librarium is the Grand Chamber, where here other librarians will gather to study and meditate. The silence here will be profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of pages or soft incantations of librarians as they focus their minds. Many will have their eyes closed in concentration or hidden beneath psychic hoods, both of which hide the weight of their responsibilities to harness the warp without succumbing to its peril. In the centre of the chamber, one might well imagine, to my mind, a massively ornate carved lectern upon which rests the Codex Astartes, the sacred tome containing the teachings of Rabute Guilliman. This ancient volume serves as the chapter guide, offering wisdom, strategies for both war and governance. And surrounding the lectern are stasis fields containing relics of unimaginable power, weapons wielded by legendary heroes, artifacts from forgotten ages. The Librarium also serves as a repository for the chapter's armory of force weapons and other esoteric equipment. These weapons, which include blades, staves and axes, are attuned to specific librarians, which makes them often useless other than blunt instruments in the hands of others. Each force weapon allows its wielder to channel their psychic might into a concentrated point, delivering devastating blows to their enemies through a device known as a psi convector. This device typically takes the form of a serpentine pattern etched across the weapon's surface, and it focuses and directs the librarian's psychic energy. Force weapons are very powerful, but to attune oneself to a weapon is a very arduous task. It requires months or even years of dedicated practice, which means that very often a force weapon is individual to its user. This challenge is then also compounded by inheriting potentially a blade from a previous wielder, as effectively it will have to be retuned to the new user. But the effort of aligning such a weapon is well rewarded, for any librarian wielding a force weapon can strike down some of the most formidable and well-armoured targets with a single decisive blow, melting through armour, shielding and flesh. Within a librarian, the ambient atmosphere itself is charged with psychic energy. The air hums with latent power, and the very stones in the walls themselves seem to pulse with an unforeseen force. The shadows here are deeper. They move independently, the air thicker, as if the warp itself were watching and waiting. For a librarian, this presence is both comforting and unsettling. But more than anything else, it's a constant reminder to them of the need for vigilance against the encroaching darkness. In such a place where knowledge is both weapon and shield, the librarians stand as guardians of their chapter's legacy. The librarian is more than its name suggests, far more than a mere library. It is a sanctum of power, a focal point of the indomitable spirit of the ASTARTES and their unyielding dedication. For it is here, within the shadows and the silence, that in so many ways, both physical and metaphorical, the future of the Imperium itself is shaped and safeguarded. Librarians broadly possess their own ranking system separate from the majority of Space Marine rankings, and that's used to determine their power, responsibilities and influence within the chapter. This hierarchy begins with the Lexicanum, progresses through to the Codicea, advances to the Epistolary, and culminates with the Chief Librarian. The Lexicanum rank represents the entry point for young librarians. They're newly initiated individuals who have successfully passed their trials and are now considered worthy of serving under the Chief Librarian. These nascent psykers have not yet seen significant combat and are very much still in the process of mastering their own abilities. Collectively known as Lexicani, they are primarily tasked with maintaining, studying, and cataloguing the vast archives of text within the librarian. Their role is crucial to preserving the chapter's rich history and knowledge. In terms of appearance, they may be easily mistaken for more regular Space Marines due to their lack of a psychic hood and other distinct markings, apart from two notable exceptions. They're required by the Codex Astartes to don blue armour, a universal symbol of their status as librarians, and additionally that armour features a pauldron with the librarian symbol alongside the herald of their chapter. As a Lexicanum gains experience and hones their skills, they can then ascend to the rank of Codicea. Now, Codiceas are more seasoned librarians who possess greater mastery over their psychic abilities and have undergone very extensive training. They continue to operate within the librarian, but assume a more active role in missions and combat. They organise and oversee the activities of the Lexicani while reporting to higher ranking librarians still. And while the majority of librarians reach this rank, only a select few will progress beyond it. Codiceas are still powerful psykers. They're capable of wielding their abilities with precision on the battlefield, but they typically do not wear a psychic hood, relying instead on their honed skills and devices that are more beneficial than those used by Imperial sanctioned psykers in the Astra Militarum, for example. Then there are those exceptional individuals who transcend the rank of Codicea. The next stage in their journey is to becoming the Epistolary. Now, Epistolaries are very formidable battle psykers, entrusted with two primary roles: engaging in combat against the most formidable foes and serving as the chief psychic communications officer for the chapter's fleet. They function as the strategic command center, directing fleets, coordinating planetary assaults and providing crucial intelligence during military operations. Epistolaries will usually be seen to wear a psychic hood, which augments their defensive capabilities that also carry a force weapon into battle. So they're very high ranking when it comes to librarians, and they will have full access to the full armory of their chapter as well, enhancing their effectiveness into warfare. They might, for example, wear Terminator armor, and on the battlefield, Epistolaries will be able to unleash truly terrifying psychic powers, communications between other librarians and ships in orbit, able to clearly demonstrate an advanced level of mastery with psychic powers. At the very pinnacle of the hierarchy stands the Chief Librarian. That is the most powerful psyker within a chapter, and that rank is very usually reserved for individuals of legendary renown, only a handful of millions ever achieving it, because Chief Librarians are revered as the masters, even say demigods of psychic might. They possess unparalleled abilities that very few can rival. The Chief Librarian will be therefore responsible for overseeing the training and selection of new librarians, as well as cultivating psykers within the chapter's ranks. They hold a vast knowledge of the chapter, its enemies, and the Imperium. Their wisdom and foresight make them indispensable advisors to the chapter master as well, aiding in strategic decisions and also divining the future. And whilst Chief Librarians rarely engage directly in battle because of the immense value of their knowledge and their guidance, their presence on the battlefield is awe-inspiring. They can unleash cataclysmic displays of psychic power, bringing down environmental structures, leveling fortresses, reducing armies to rivers of molten slag, and conjuring raging storms of arcane energy that turn enemies en masse to ashes. Their abilities are just unmatched, save for beings like the Emperor Malkador or psychic primarchs like Magnus. In the ranks of the Space Marines, Librarians are defined by this clear chain of command and a progression of psychic mastery. Each rank carries with it unique responsibilities and challenges, and that clear organisation helps to enshrine a level of discipline and structure that's entirely required for Librarians to effectively safeguard and contribute to the chapter's strength. So Space Marine Librarians often possess, understandably, an insatiable curiosity and genuine enjoyment when exploring the vast potential of their psychic powers, not unlike their traitor brethren the Thousand Sons, who initiated this entire discipline so long ago. It is a fascination that for many often borders on obsession, because to these warrior scholars, the warp represents a boundless frontier of knowledge and power, offering an infinite array of abilities to study and master. They spend all of their time engaged in the study of this discipline, and so understandably, many will also spiral onto a line of investigation that can unleash some truly bizarre or devastating powers. Each librarian approaches their psychic power with a unique perspective that's shaped by their chapter doctrines and personal inclinations. While some will revel in the raw destructive potential of abilities like unleashing an inferno, channeling their psychic might to release devastating waves of warp fire upon their enemies, others find a more enriching connection to the subtle manipulation of reality, bending time and space to their will, as seen in powers like Veil of Time. Always, though, the intricate and intense mental discipline required to wield these powers is a source of both challenge and satisfaction that few other than their fellow librarians can begin to understand, because they will continuously refine their skills to achieve greater feats of psychic prowess, and that deep engagement with the warp only further fuels their dedication to the Imperium's defense, for with each new mastery, not only will it enhance their combat effectiveness, but also deepens their understanding of the galaxy itself. Veil of Time is a powerful psychic ability employed by Chief Librarian Tigurius of the Ultramarines. This ability allows him to manipulate the flow of time around himself and his allies, granting them foresight into enemy movements and attacks, and as a result those affected can react with preternatural speed and precision, anticipating danger, adjusting their actions accordingly. It's a very powerful ability to use in battle because it can turn the tide of things, giving the Ultramarines the ability to evade incoming attacks or strike with unparalleled accuracy. Tigurius' mastery of the warp is such that he's often considered the most powerful psyker among the loyalist Astartes chapters. And given the Ultramarines' unparalleled reputation for strategic planning and battlefield tactics, a psychic ability such as Veil of Time reflects their emphasis on discipline and strategic superiority. Fury of the Salamander is used, of course, by librarians of the Salamanders chapter. They will conjure the flame and fury of their homeworld and the terrible lizards that dwell upon it, driving it toward their enemies. The flames twist and writhe into the form of an ancient and powerful drake. They summon and control searing flames from the warp, creating a devastating twisting figure of fire which engulfs all enemies in its path. The infernal blaze burns with an unnatural intensity, capable of melting through armor and reducing enemies to ashes. The flames are a manifestation of the librarian's will, controlled with precision. This power of course exemplifies Salamander's affinity for fire and their creative approach to warfare, which is of course due to the deep connection of their volcanic homeworld and the elemental forces which shaped their culture and their combat doctrine. But it also highlights the Salamander's role as both protectors and avengers, using purifying power to cleanse the Imperium of its foes. The ability to produce a literal dragon made of fire which rains down on the enemies is certainly enough to disrupt formations, flush out entrenched positions, and force your enemy into the open, where they can then be more easily targeted by the rest of the chapter's formidable firepower. The psychic power known as the Avenger is a devastating psychic attack used by Chief Librarian Ezekiel of the Dark Angels. This ability manifests as a searing beam of psychic energy that incinerates enemies caught in its path. It's capable of burning through armor and flesh with ease and leaves nothing but ash in its wake. And although arguably quite straightforward, it is simply a raw distillation of the sheer power of a Chief Librarian to channel the wrath of the Emperor into a singular, focused psychic assault. But the Dark Angels are very much known for their secretive nature, their relentless pursuit of the fallen, and of course any of those lost brothers they discover are put before relentless, horrifying interrogation. So Ezekiel's use of the Avenger reflects the chapter's unforgiving approach to their enemies, their commitment to take action where it is immediately necessary and focus maximal power immediately to that task at hand. Now, the Imperial Fists are renowned for their stoic resilience, their siege warfare expertise, but being experts in defense and tactical acumen means that you also understand how to break through the formidable defenses of your enemy, destroy even the most heavily protected targets. And the Psychic Power Null Zone highlights the chapter's focus on this understanding, this precision and effective ability to target enemy defenses and break through them. The Psychic Power Null Zone weakens the protective fields of enemy Psykers and demons, but also within the Null Zone of the Psyker, enemies will find their shields faltering, leaving them vulnerable to the Imperial Fist's unyielding heavy assault. And as we will discuss with some other abilities, it's a good example of how not every psychic ability has to be offensive. Often it is about weakening an enemy so that you can, in coordination with the rest of the chapter, lead devastating assaults. Now, we haven't talked too much about Space Wolves Librarians. They are a little bit different than most other librarians, but again, that's probably something I want to include within the actual Space Wolves discussion. So the Librarian Njal Stormcaller unleashes an ability known as Fury of the Ancients. It's a powerful psychic storm that calls forth the spirits of ancient warriors, unleashing a tempest of psychic energy, which tears through the battlefield. The storm then engulfs the enemies, disrupting their formations, sowing chaos in their ranks, and of course, devastating them. This kind of calling psychic power aligns perfectly with Space Wolves Librarians, or Rune Priests as they're known, because the Space Wolves, whilst being known for their ferocity, also hold a deep connection to their past. And the Fury of the Ancients reflects this deep spiritual connection and the mystical powers they see in their Rune Priests. This ability embodies the Space Wolves' savagery and their reverence for the ancestral spirits to guide them in battle. Now, as noted, Space Marine Librarians across all different chapters are capable of wielding any manner and number of formidable powers. Each reflects their own personal characteristics, blended with the style and strategic doctrines of the respective chapter, but there are of course many more of varying power, purpose, and curiosity. I've chosen the Vortex of Doom as a fun example of a psychic power because, for one thing, it's a vortex-based weapon, which is some of my favourite stuff. It unsurprisingly tears open the fabric of reality, creating a swirling maelstrom of pure warp energy. And the vortex is a manifestation of the unrestrained power of the Immaterium. It will just annihilate everything in its vicinity, indiscriminately consuming enemies, terrain, even allies if they're caught within its reach, which is one of my favourite reasons for all vortex weaponry. It's just chaotic madness in choosing to unleash even such a weapon. Not to mention the catastrophic potential for it to just engulf the Librarian themselves, or in the worst case scenario, even collapsing into a larger warp breach that could have disastrous expanding effects on the surrounding area, or even the planet for that matter. Tormented Flesh is a gruesome ability deployed by the Red Scorpions. And in this, the librarian will focus on his foe's flawed physiology and corrupted spirit, turning it then against them. The enemy's flesh will literally rebel against its owner. It twists, oozes, bursts, it rends, fleeing against the energy and power which saturates it. This power is only effective on foes which are either corrupted of chaos, have a mutation, or some other demonic gift. But as an example that not all psychic powers are stable or safe to use, if the target that the librarian is aiming for in using this power is unsuccessfully targeted, then this can come back onto the librarian themselves, where they will end up taking some damage. Skysight is an ability used by the Nova Marine librarians. It's an example again of how not all powers need to be brutally focused on physically crushing or destroying enemies, because Skysight enables the Psyker to lift their consciousness, enabling them to look down upon a battlefield as if they were high in the skies above, picking out details on the ground that even the most sophisticated of sensors could miss. It's a tactically powerful tool which could turn the tide of really any battle, not least because enemies are entirely ignorant to this massive advantage gained by the opposing force. However, whilst the librarian is gazing at the battlefield and inspecting, of course, whilst their mind is elsewhere, they need to be guarded, for they're very vulnerable to attack whilst in this state of being. Then some powers can fall somewhere in between the offensive and the tactical. In the case of the Hammer of Man, used by the Crimson Fists, the librarian focuses his hatred of Xenos into a tangible force, which he then projects out around him, causing pain and anguish to any who are not human. Any Xenos affected by this power will be instantly aware of its source though, and may seek out the librarian as a target to end their own pain. But the power only affects Xenos and has no effect on creatures which are not truly alive, like demons or machines, or those which have even a small degree of human ancestry, such as most mutants, abhumans, and of course space marines. But that's a fun one because effectively the Psyker is basically projecting their anger, their dislike of everybody around them, and therefore inflicting physical pain through just their unhappiness. To finish, I think you can hardly ever go harder than the Karkaradon ability known as Rending Maw. It's quite self-explanatory and awe-inspiring. The librarian calls forth the avatar of a great oceanic predator, one might suggest perhaps a megalodon, whose gaping maw erupts from the very ground beneath the enemy. The stones and earth, or the infrastructure which is collapsed from a city, say, reform into the shape of jaws and teeth that mangle and snap shut around the enemies that Psyker is targeting, consumes all in a shower of gore. Those that are not instantly crushed or ripped apart are then dragged down with the retreating maw to likely a slow death. Perhaps a very rare few may claw their way back to the surface. It's completely mad, and honestly for this power alone it makes me want to start a space sharks army, just as the foot of Gork makes me want to start an orc army. The role of a librarian is as much a burden as it is a blessing. They are the keepers of the chapter's history, wielders of incredible psychic talents, yet they must constantly guard against weakness within their ranks. Librarians vigilantly scour the minds of their brothers, noting any signs of deviance, no matter how minor. This scrutiny ensures the purity of mind essential to their chapter's ideals. Those who have suffered intense psychic trauma will be regularly screened, their minds and souls cleansed to protect both the individual and the gene seed within them. Librarians work tirelessly with the chapter's apothecaries to therefore root out any hints of corruption, and if they were discovered, of course, to isolate this. In the contemporary period, the choice to utilise librarians at all still remains with each chapter, because librarians are among the most intriguing aspects of the Space Marines, but also potentially the most unstable. They possess unmatched power, skilled with bolter and blade, but constantly battle for their souls, warding off demonic threats which seek endlessly to claim them. Their growing powers make them coveted prizes for the warp's malign entities, and this forces them to maintain that unwavering discipline and vigilance. But much like the unique histories and traditions that define each Space Marine chapter, librarians are as varied in their roles as are their brothers who exist in their own respective ranks. For example, within the Space Wolves, as we were saying before, the role of a librarian is known as what is referred to as a rune priest. and that's to do with generally the Space Wolves culture, because these warriors believe that their powers stem from their homeworld of Fenris rather than the warp. It's to do with their ancestry, and they don't consider themselves psykers as they will see in others, because rune priests eschew the written records typical of other librarians, preferring their own path and traditions, such as the ancient art of storytelling. Some of their training will involve journeying to each great company of wolves and spending a full year learning and memorizing their sagas, so that by the end of the journey, the rune priest possesses a complete and first-hand knowledge of the Space Wolves' lore, something they consider essential to be able to effectively operate as psychic guardians and wardens of the chapter. Salamander's librarians will also mentor their brothers, ensuring they remain grounded in the ideals of protecting humanity and standing against the darkness, wielding the power of flame to illuminate them in their darkest hours, preserving tradition and inspiring their battle brothers. Despite these and many other chapters utilizing librarians across any number of diverse roles, the life of a librarian is in fact often marked by solitude. This is because they stand apart from their battle brothers. They might be respected and revered, yet they're also feared and mistrusted, no matter what anybody would say. And this unfortunate duality stems from their powers, because even in M41, in the eyes of many an ordinary Marine, a librarian is a living weapon, and more specifically, a weapon of the warp. They understand the inherent dangers in this, no matter how carefully trained and protected they are. Every time a chapter librarian taps into the warp, especially in battle, there is always, no matter how small, a risk of corruption and temptation, and for them to become consumed and unlock a corridor to the warp. Their brothers know this, leading to an undercurrent of suspicion and mistrust that lingers beneath the surface. It was one of the reasons the Emperor likely chose to outlaw librarians in the first place, and interestingly, that order was technically never rescinded that we are aware of, meaning that in M41, Astartes chapters, including the Ultramarines, despite being commanded now by Lord Guilliman, are all technically still breaking the orders of the Emperor, because an open mind is like a fortress with unbarred gates. For librarians, this means they must guard their thoughts against any distractions or insidious entities that could lead them astray forever. The existence of a librarian is a delicate balance of respect and fear, a burden born with the knowledge that in many instances, whether their brothers are truly aware of it or not, the fate of their entire chapter rests upon their shoulders. They are the ultimate bulwark against the eternal darkness and the never-born entities of the Immaterium.